Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sophie Gerald, and on behalf of the British Neuroscience Association, I'd like to give a warm welcome to you all for the fifth and final webinar in this series, which is hosted with our partners, the Psychiatry Consortium. I want to note my sincere thanks to you all for taking the time to be with us today, especially in light of the continued and shocking events. With so many of us feeling wretched and powerless, coming together to celebrate the sharing of ideas feels not insignificant. We feel very fortunate to be joined by attendees from all over the world, so do let us know where you're dialing in from and say hello in the chat. This series has considered all perspectives of the psychiatric drug discovery pipeline, from people with lived experience of mental health, academic researchers, clinicians, and industry scientists. And although you'll likely hear today how we don't have all the answers, it is clear that we must all be involved in the development of solutions if we are to overcome the hurdles to psychiatric drug development. With 1 in 4 people estimated to experience mental health challenges in their lifetime, this means we are talking about a shared experience that many of us will recognise. Just before we start, and whilst people are still joining, we have a few housekeeping rules to go over. We will be using the chat and Q&A function today, so do feel free to say hello and post comments in the chat. But if you have any specific questions for our panelists, then please make sure you use the Q&A function for these, and you should see both the chat and the Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen. There will be a Q&A session after the discussion with a chance for our panelists to answer any questions you may have, so do feel free to post your questions at any time during the talks and we'll pick them up at the end. You can also ask questions anonymously if you wish to do so. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that this webinar is being recorded with the permission of our speakers and will be available to watch on demand on the BNA's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, just a reminder to please adhere to the BNA's Code of Conduct for webinars and engage respectfully online. We are delighted to be working with Laura Ajram and Ekta Patel from the Psychiatry Consortium, working together to strengthen the links between psychiatry and neuroscience. As one of today's panelists and patient advocate Simon Rose notes, conjoined drug discovery is about the whole person and human approach, and how complex needs are recognised in terms of research. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Ekta Patel. Over to you.
Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to you all on behalf of the Psychiatry Consortium. So I'm really glad to be here with the BNA in our final part of this 5-part webinar series. So apologies to those of you that have heard this introduction before, but for anyone who's new to this webinar for the first time, the Psychiatry Consortium launched back in 2019 in response to a huge patient unmet need in psychiatry with a primary focus on medicines discovery. And we work together by bringing medical research charities, pharmaceutical companies, academics and SMEs to help drive challenging preclinical research for the identification and validation of novel drug targets. Our latest funding call will open next week on the 28th of March, and this will leverage on the momentum of our recent engagement with the research community via the Agitation in Alzheimer's Target Product Profile that was co-developed by MDC and ARUK. We'll be welcoming expressions of interest, which is a brief high-level outline to your application on novel targets for the treatment of agitation in dementia. To learn more about this call and to hear from Dr. Kathy Liu and our Psychiatry Consortium partners, please join our webinar on the 28th of March at 2 p.m, and the registration details for that will be on our website. So alongside vital project funding, we also engage the research community globally, and we provide opportunity for collaborations. And this is where our partnership with the BNA's Building Bridges aligns so well. So today is the final of this series of 5 webinars between BNA and Psychiatry Consortium, and we have provided a comprehensive overview on the challenges and opportunities of neuroscience drug discovery from a range of perspectives over the last 6 months. And we're really so grateful to all of our speakers throughout this series. In today's webinar, we're going to be looking forward to pulling this series together with a selection of speakers who will be representing each of the different sectors we've heard from so far. Today will be an opportunity to pick up on these key themes across the series, We've heard from academics, clinicians, industry representatives, and people with lived experiences to learn about their specific experiences and challenges. We've found similarities and differences across these groups, but there's been an overwhelming similarity in our desire to really work together to transform neuroscience drug discovery. I'm now going to hand over to Kevin Cox, who hosted our introductory session for this series, and is now back to wrap everything up and to dive deeper into these themes that have come up so far. So to Kevin, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Hector. And actually, if you could release the videos of all the other participants, I think that'd be really helpful, just so that we can see who's also taking part today. As Hector said, this is the final series. It's going to take a slightly different format to the previous webinars, where there's been a bit of a presentation from each of the participants, followed by a discussion. This is actually going to be purely discussion points. So we are going to cover a number of themes that have been opened up previously. But the primary objective of today's session is to say, okay, what next? I think we've uncovered some really interesting issues that need to be dealt with. But now we need to sort of put actions in place to say, what are the next steps that perhaps both the BNA and the Psychiatric Consortium can support to ensure we continue to move this whole program forwards. As Hector mentioned, we have representatives from each of our key groups that have been involved so far. So Simon, who's representing our lived experience group. We have John, who actually is, as he says to me, he's representing, I guess, more of a translational science perspective, coming at it from a slightly different area. So we'll get some insights from him. Trudy, who's a clinician, is going to sort of ensure that we don't lose sight of what the clinicians actually need in developing programs. Ashley Han, who is our industry representative, who's clearly going to have some insights into what is expected from industry in helping to move things forward. So a good group, a wide set of experiences, and we're going to try and cover two themes, really. One is a little bit about the science and some of the challenges faced around the science, and particularly as it relates to psychiatry, and then also some more generic concepts, which are, quite frankly, probably common across all interfaces between academia and industry. And through that, we hope to be able to identify some specifics that we can take forward. I would encourage people who are listening today, and generally I think we have quite a good audience from around the world, to ask questions as we go through, so that we don't just wait till the end, because it may be certain topics and certain discussion points are worthy of further discussion as we go through the program. So please feel free to ask your questions, and I will try and present them back to our participants as soon as possible. So what I'd like to start with then is a little bit more investigation and understanding of some of the scientific challenges that are faced in developing treatments for psychiatric diseases. And I think one of the things we tend to lose sight of is the science, and the application of that science is not just down to academia, it's actually down to other people that are intimately involved in this whole process. And that is those with lived experience, so Simon in this case, and of course the clinicians, because everything has to be fitted into a clinical pathway. So we recognize, I think, that psychiatric diseases are difficult to diagnose, they're overlapping, there is no clear scientific target in many instances. And so really what we end up having potentially is a disconnect between what one party expects and what another party expects. And I think that what we'd like to do today is to explore how we can improve the connectivity to ensure that everybody's voice is taken into consideration. So maybe Simon, if I could start with you, because I think you've got some very clear thoughts on this area of what needs to be done. And not just what needs to be done, I'm going to ask you, and how should we do it as a secondary question.
That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? And if I knew what should be done and how it should be done, I think we'd probably be doing it already. I think you're absolutely right in recognizing the complexity of things. I think there are undoubtedly many comorbidities. There are lots of overlaps, which makes unpicking it all really quite difficult. For me, I think things go beyond that, because there's an interface between illness and real life, and an illness and an interface between illness, which is a legitimate target of medicine, and real life, which needs more psychosocial interventions. And I think for me, the nub of this is how we work together, how the multiple stakeholders work together, and patients, people with lived experience, are a key stakeholder in this. How do we help to guide you to unpick what is a legitimate target for medicine, and what needs intervention from politicians and more social supports, and I think for me it comes back over and over and over again to talking to each other and working together, and bringing structures where we work as partners. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, Simon, thanks very much. Thank you. I mean, and maybe just as a follow-on question, it was a really good point earlier on about the importance of charities, or certainly patient representative groups. Do you think we are engaging most effectively with those sort of stakeholders in this whole process?
I think generally it's improving, it's getting better, but there's so much more that can be done. And individual academic institutions will have their own patient public groups that are attached to them. It's a case of coming up with a strategy, coming up with a plan, and then following it through. But it will involve bringing charities more into play than they currently are, as well as other groups as well.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks very much. So Trudy, maybe now we've heard sort of the person with lived experience. What's your perspective as a clinician, and how and do we engage most effectively with the people that are actually then delivering these treatments?
That's another brilliant. I think that's a really, really brilliant question. I think we've got an awful long way to go, actually. An awful long way to go. I think, one of the challenges for people with mental illness or mental health problems and psychiatric illness is that we're still so far behind in terms of discovery, just in terms of etiology. The brain is a really complex organ, and just in terms of things like neurochemistry and imaging, neurobiology, psychopharmacogenetics, there's still so much more discovery to happen. And I think one of the things that's perhaps stopping us is that, perhaps certain, say, drug discoveries in the past have happened a bit serendipitously, whether it was Largactil in the 1950s or even sort of moving on to antidepressants in the 80s. People are frightened of engaging in that discovery pipeline. And I think engaging with people so that actually we, in that pipeline of discovery, we are able to sieve out side effects of certain medications, have more people engaging in trials of treatments is essential. And I think one of the huge factors that stops people from stepping forward is stigma and fear of what might happen if they were to trial and test a new particular drug. What if actually it makes my depression worse? What if it makes my psychosis worse? So I think that engagement with patients is critical in the pipeline of psychiatric drugs. And we're not there yet. And I think if we actually engage even more, with our patients and carers and service users particularly, it would be a significant step. And I think we need to be a lot braver as well. I don't think we have that partnership between clinicians, patients, and sort of the discovery pipeline working together. I think we can work much more to demystify actually and the benefits potentially of sort of moving forwards and taking this together.
I like the concept of being more brave. It's sort of let's just hit those issues head on rather than sort of trying to sidestep them all the time and believing we understand what the real issues are.
Yeah, because we don't know. And I think we do in psychiatry. I think we do sidestep the issue because we're fearful of the implications of getting it wrong.
Right.
If we think of sort of the non-maleficence rule of, let's not, we don't want to do any harm in practicing and looking after people. And of course, because we're talking about our brain, because we're talking about psychiatry and our mental health, there's a risk of getting it wrong. Of course, that's potentially a big risk, isn't it, to get it wrong?
Indeed, indeed. Thanks, Trudy. And John and Ashley, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I'm actually just going to dial back into Simon and ask a follow-up question, which really sort of maybe build on what Trudy said. Simon, are we not brave enough?
Absolutely not. But as Trudy was talking, I was thinking about the impact of the amazing work that's done on COVID vaccines, and how lots of the barriers have been swept away. And we've got a precedent for making sure that it can happen. We've engaged huge numbers of people in getting those vaccines developed.
Yeah,
that there will be lessons learned from there as to how those barriers can be overcome. But absolutely, I suspect that there are all sorts of barriers from all sides, and it is just a case of working through them. But we have done it in other areas, and we can do it in psychiatry as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. So John, you're actually, I think, as you explained to me, your experience or your current activities are more associated with neurodegenerative diseases rather than psychiatric diseases. But I think you were saying as well that there are some things to be learnt of the way things have done. The things you've carried out so far that you feel could be applied into this context. Could you sort of expand on those a little bit for us?
Yes, well, it's interesting listening to what Simon and Trudy have sort of honed in on. And I think when it comes down to basic understanding of diseases, one of the revolutions I've watched, especially in the dementia space, has been starting with the people. Forget about animal models for your basic research. Go and work on people. And I think that's had two impacts. One is there's been a huge amount of population studies, whether it's genetics or simply following traits and trying to understand them. And it also helps to engage the public as well and create those links between basic researchers and clinicians. So you automatically end up with a more integrated research environment, which is, I think, fantastic. And then beyond that, the science, I think, is actually driving in the right direction. If you look at dementia, we have studied the same two genes for 20 years. Then in the last 5 years, the genetics has just blown open the whole field. And all of a sudden, we have a host of new approaches coming into the clinic. And I think that's what we need in the psychiatric space as well.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, we actually just had a question come through which actually relates to that, John. So I'm going to come back to you and dial that back to you in a second. But I'd just like to bring in Ashley Han just momentarily, because it's interesting. I think your company is taking a slightly different perspective. You're starting with a sort of, in a sense, scientific hypothesis in a way. And I would imagine determining where it's best to be applied. So you're looking at specific approaches to disease treatment. So that's, in a way, it's a reverse. So rather than sort of saying what disease needs treatment, you've got a treatment that said, what disease do we go for? Is that right? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I heard this frame of thought for the first time, but you are right. I think when we stumbled on our asset, psilocybin, our own psilocybin COMP360, from the history of the use of this compound, we knew that it was transdiagnostic. There was already early evidence for it to be used for very different populations in psychiatry. So our approach, kind of actually what was already said, is to take patients first and to find where the significant and highest unmet need is, so that we can serve the people who are in most need. But you're right that we obviously do explore what other populations we can serve, which is really interesting given the heterogeneity of the groups of illnesses.
And just for those probably, I'm sure most people know, but psilocybin is essentially the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. Is that right? So we should have quite a lot of evidence so far of some of the benefits of it, one way or another.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, I guess just a couple of thoughts that are popping up in my mind as we discuss is the involvement of patients, right? Because it's almost, I think, these treatments that from magic mushrooms was demanded by the population, people who have the means, self-medicating or wanting to find some use of these mushrooms to medicate themselves. And with that, I think the the industry realized this demand and then the opportunity to serve patients, which is now what we are trying to do it in the most safe way through clinical trials. So I think it's really interesting to think about that shift from patient being external to these processes versus patients demanding and wanting to be involved. And we hear from our patients, the ones that were involved, that not only, they're interested in these kind of treatments, but they also want to be part of the medication, the process of healing themselves. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, great, thank you. So actually you do have the patient experience already. You're just trying to work out what's the best way to apply that back into the product. I'm just going to open up with some of the questions that have come through, because I think they're very relevant and pertinent to this stage of the conversation. So the first one that I'd like to ask, and anybody can answer it, but it may be relevant to what John has just said, is the question is this: given the comorbidity of psychiatric illnesses and the heterogeneity of this comorbidity, bit of a mouthful, do we need to think more in terms of the individual and personalized medicine treatments? John, does that come back to your thoughts about genetics?
Well, I think it does. I mean, one of the big challenges in all of these types of diseases, where, as we say, there's a lot of comorbidity, is stratifying and trying to work out which drug or mechanistic approach you could apply to a particular subgroup of patients. And I was struck by what Simon said right at the very beginning, in his sort of perspective, coming from the patient and their lived experience, their experience every day. One of the areas I'm really interested in, I think it's got tremendous potential, is the digital monitoring of patients, digital biomarkers. And, this is going to help smooth out all of those day-to-day variances in our lives that complicate trials and the way we answer questionnaires. I mean, if I fill out one of those questionnaires, I'm terrible. I start thinking, what do they really want? How should I answer that question? So, and I'm sure patients find it the same. So I think that type of approach will be fantastically useful at quantitating responses and helping us to identify really what type of issue any given patient has, or what combination of issues they have.
Trudy, Simon,
Trudy will have a lot more to say.
Yeah, yes, I'm sure. Are these things already happening? Are we already seeing moves in this direction?
Was that for me?
Trudy or Simon?
Sorry, Trudy.
Yeah.
After you, Trudy.
Oh, I mean, we're sort of doing some of that, but I think there's, as I said at the start, I think there's so much more we need to do. And I think in psychiatry, that heterogeneity of the presentation is a really important one. So the different types of, you can't really stick to one disorder sometimes, as the BNF or as the ICD-10 or DSM-5 might want us to do. Actually, people are people, and they present with a complex array of symptoms, often straddling, a whole anxiety spectrum, a depressive spectrum, possibly a psychotic spectrum, and actually that's I think where our research and our investigation and our medication and our pipelines need to move into, which is that sort of heterogeneity of presentation, and then thinking about, well, actually, what are the potential treatments based on that presentation? So it's to focus more on symptoms and individuality, which is much more personalized, isn't it? And then to think, actually, can we bring different bits of biological treatments together in that personalized care? If it's a tablet that we're bringing together, which is bringing together a bit of an anxiolytic and an antidepressant and whatever into the individual, in addition to the other suite of treatments they're going to be receiving, bearing in mind it won't necessarily be just purely biological treatments people are getting. There'll be a suite of other biological treatments too, which is essential.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. I think you're going to comment as well.
I was just picking up on John's point. Absolutely, there is so much potential in sort of digital monitoring, and we're seeing the tip of the iceberg with the commercial kind of fitness industry applications. and that it needs to be picked. There's just so many really exciting opportunities to really get our teeth into and make a difference. But we aren't there yet. So it's having the vision and the bravery to do something different to what's always been done.
Thank you very much. And then actually, Han, really sort of coming from the other perspective, is this this concept of personalized medicine or stratification of patients, let's say going into your clinical trials, is that something you are contemplating in your own internal development programs?
Yeah, I think what we just talked about, they're almost like two extremes to this question. One is going towards personalized medicine, and the other is giving our current understanding of a lot of psychiatric disorders, sharing a common neurophysiological mechanism, maybe find treatments or therapies that might serve more than one population, that falls under different indications in diagnosis. And I think there is that sweet spot of what actually that means, because we're nowhere near to serving an individual very specifically or finding something that cure it all. So what we try to do, as you said, is to try to cluster the right parameters to find the heterogeneity that's in the right level. I also feel like actually going into digital biomarkers, that's really important. And to me, in industry, what needs to happen a little bit more is using those digital biomarkers with other metrics as well. So when we're going into clinical trials or working on a compound, already collecting that data rather than doing digital research independently from clinical and basic science research, because then when the data is all integrated, it's the most powerful.
Does it not pose a regulatory problem about, though? How do you determine what the end point is that sort of says yes or no, the drug is working or is achieving what your objectives are?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging. I mean, obviously, we are free to add some exploratory endpoints on top of what is required by the regulators to be primary outcomes of research, but that brings up, the costs increase, the risks increase, because obviously the data on exploratory disease are not going to be foreseen. But at the same time, if we don't put those risky moves in place, we don't learn. And I mean, as Trudy said, just not even being able to understand etiology, let alone, classification of diagnosis, it's really challenging. So it's another, I think, optimization problem, how much you can research and how much you can involve the patients proactively that want to be involved while also meeting the regulatory criteria.
Yeah. One of the things that I picked up at an earlier discussion was very much about the common objectives of all parties concerned, but in particular the focus that maybe academia has on trying to address a problem versus what industry might have. And the suggestion was that actually industry at the moment is focusing its resources more on treating the symptoms rather than actually curing the disease. Now, do you think that is correct, and indeed, should it be where the resource should go, or does there need to be some element of realignment here? And then I'd open up that to anybody that has a thought on that idea.
Or maybe I can say something
John.
To kick off. I mean, in my own field, it's been very interesting. I've worked in neuroscience for quite a while in the pharma industry as well. And it was interesting to see how a lot of companies withdrew from the neurosciences, sort of starting in 2000 or so. And of course, that was because these were incredibly risky disease areas in which to try to develop a new treatment. The failure rate of approaches was very high. And so I think, the job that we've got to do, well, certainly what I've found myself trying to do now that I'm an academic and working more with charities, is to de-risk novel approaches, whether they're symptomatic or disease modifying, so that I can then encourage somebody to invest in that idea. And that investment can come from a VC, a small biotech company, or a large pharma company. The problem is still the same. We've got to de-risk these novel approaches so that they can justify investing in them.
That's an interesting. I mean, I guess that's in a sense a truism. But how on earth do you de-risk these novel approaches? Is it you put it into a pre-competitive environment and have a much broader understanding of the biology, or what sort of has worked for you so far in that respect?
Well, actually, I think all of those approaches do work. So you just mentioned a pre-competitive environment. I think that can be a very powerful approach. You know, in Oxford, they've been a part of a consortium, the Structural Genomics Consortium, which was designed to just put out reagents freely accessible to anybody who wanted to use them, including companies. And that has undoubtedly helped academics and companies explore those target classes and identify ones which are clinically worthy of follow-up. And some have now progressed into the clinic. So that type of open access approach is great. And you've seen some of that type of activity, COVID medicines as well.
Yeah.
But then also closer to home, I think, just setting up initiatives to try and boost the amount of work, research work, academic work, but also biotech funding. That's another way as well. Obviously more commercially minded, but it's just as valid an approach.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts on that, on de-risking an early stage? If not, then I'll turn to another question, which really is one that addresses one of the other themes I think that's come out of this event, and that is this learning and this forgive me, I'll get it wrong. We're getting academia to think for the future, to plan ahead, to think beyond just purely the biology, and to think about what the end point is, where is this whole program going? So we had a question, and it was directed to John, but I think it can be helpful for anybody to respond, to say, how do you educate people into the process of drug development, but also the implications that might have on the clinical practice at the end of the day. So what experiences do you have, and what ideas do you have about how we might start to get people to think a little bit longer term? Actually, Hannah, I think you're nodding. I think it'd be interesting what you have to say on that.
Yeah, I do feel strongly. I mean, I think in collaborations with Psychiatric Consortium, it actually made me realize as there was a gap here, the way the academic proposals came to us, it was clear that probably, just the proposal owner researchers did not quite know what could happen once the validation or the identification of the target that they were talking about could then lead into, basically the clinical trials and patients, and how the preclinical development would happen. And I think Psychiatric Consortium has been doing a great job giving that feedback and providing some information, but I think it would be really beneficial. And to be honest, I don't think it's that complicated. It's in a couple hours, you can explain most of what parameters the industry side scientists think in terms of safety, efficacy in preclinical and clinical. Obviously, there are a ton of details, but just so the researchers understand what's at stake. Because otherwise, I think we all understand, especially just with the question of our basic understanding of psychiatric disorders are quite poor, and that knowledge needs to come from academia. So there's like a great opportunity for industry and academia to collaborate on this, because it's value to both sides. But then if they do not focus on the same prioritization of parameters in research, I think collaboration is not going to be invested in, as John was saying. So I see a lot of value there.
So is that a sort of a practical next step? That where actually, so you've had the feedback directly from the Psychiatric Consortium, which is great, but actually you've had the feedback and maybe nobody else has. So do you think there's an opportunity for a coordinator like the Psychiatric Consortium and indeed the BNA to I don't know, find a mechanism through which we can expose that knowledge to a much wider group of people by some way, or make some seminar series again specifically around what do those things actually mean?
I mean, yes, I want
yes,
anyone wants to contribute from BNA or Psychiatric, I wouldn't want to speak for themselves. They might already have some plans to address this.
I think, I mean, there are quite a few initiatives for increasing interaction between industrial scientists and academic scientists, scholarships, etc. I think it would be great if universities could find a way of allowing more transfer, secondments, etc., between industry and academia. There are always IP issues. It's one of the problems, but if we could try and get a little bit more practical exchange, that would be great. I think I'm obviously a fan of what AI UK, Alzheimer's Research UK, has managed to do in the dementia space. But I would venture to suggest that their initiative of putting translational teams inside academic institutions and making sure that there are ex-pharma people, right, those units, has been very successful in terms of spreading a more translational message with pharma viewpoints into and through the institution. Because then you don't have to arrange special seminar series. It just sort of influences. Right. We can certainly see that that's been beneficial.
And just forgive me, John, but I mean, maybe Simon and Trudy, maybe you can comment. Do you actually also, through those DRIs, do you reach out to the clinicians and to the people with lived experience to get their perspective on what translation, that element of translation, and conversely, maybe before anybody answers, Simon and Trudy, do you understand the drug development process? Do you have exposure to what that actually looks like? Simon, Trudy. Simon, go ahead.
Simon, you go.
I'll come back to Trudy in a sec.
I was going to say I understand now far more than I did before I got involved in this series.
Right, interesting.
Because before this, it was completely shrouded in mystery. But I think one of the things that I come across time and time again are people that exist in, we all work in silos, and it seems to me that lessons learned involve taking people out of those silos and putting and encouraging people to talk to each other. Commercially, there are absolutely going to be difficulties with intellectual property, and how you overcome that is for people other than me. But I would urge everybody to bring all of these conversations back to the patient, because at the end of the day, the whole reason that this process exists is because there are people that are suffering, and there are things that can be discovered that will ease that suffering. And until we start thinking broadly about how we're going to do that, while we all continue to just exist in our own little bubbles, we're not actually doing the best that we can, I don't think.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And Trudy.
Yeah, and I was thinking that actually, I'm not a medication, I'm not an academic around just drug discovery. I do academic work in other areas of psychiatry, but not in drug discovery. However, as a clinician, I do engage in supporting various stages of that pipeline, but usually the sort of the clinical development phases, and then later around the sort of NICE approval. So that's sort of quite late on, isn't it? It's quite late on. And actually what I would love to see is that sort of clinician, scientist, patient partnership right at the beginning, where, rather than sort of further down the pipeline. I know there's some of that, but actually even more of that earlier on, when we're thinking about actually what new innovations might be possible, and that might be based on our pre-existing knowledge as clinicians and patients of side effects of treatment-resistant depression, for example, or any other area of psychiatry. So so much more integration in sort of, I don't know how one might do it, but sort of focus groups or discussions between consortiums, clinicians, patients, when discovery is happening.
Interesting. Okay, so I think this idea of connectivity across the whole development pipeline is I mean, everybody's coming up with the same perspective, really. We need to make it happen somehow, because there is clearly value in both directions in having greater understanding of at least where the other parties are coming from. So one of the things that we may take away from this and is say, well, what does that look like, and how we might be able to accelerate that and to improve the current state of affairs. I mean, and John, just forgive me, I'm just going back to your experience with AR UK again. Do you think that that's something that's been effectively addressed with your academics and sort of industry partners to help facilitate that translational process?
Do you mean reaching out to the very...
Yeah, bringing academia and industry together to actually have common objectives and common understanding of what needs to be done, basically.
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, each project you embark on, depending on who's around you, it's not always an ideal team. But I think there is a big push now to include, as Trudy says, clinicians, pharma people, and basic scientists. So our most successful projects have always been ones where all of those components are engaged. So perhaps a molecular geneticist from a Oxford teaching laboratory, a clinician, a neurologist working with patients day to day, a pharma collaboration so that we get input from pharma. Sometimes there's a CRO involved as well, and our own translational scientists in the university. So, already I've listed sort of 4 different groups of people who try to come together to make a project work, and they are the best projects. They're the most productive in terms of achieving, drug discovery goals, and they're the most enjoyable, to be honest.
Interesting, yeah. Aslihan, how do you deal with the IP issue that's been raised on a couple of occasions? If you're trying to sort of have these open conversations, how would you recommend that people ensure that they don't stray into areas of confidentiality?
Yeah, this is going to be a repetition of what I said in previous webinar when I presented, but I definitely do agree and see it as a barrier in some of the collaborations. What I think is the solution is, as we kind of hinted at it, is actually collaboration with legal teams, both from academic side and industry side, and an understanding of the incentives of both sides. So that generally the approach that we have a lot of academic collaborations, not having our own labs on site, the way we approach it is to very proactively engage both legal teams as early as possible and try to come to an agreement. I think not only we sometimes get pushback from legal sides and IP issues, but that also causes a lot of delays, right? There's a lot of back and forth how we solve this. So that's another, I think, an issue. So I actually would encourage everyone who works in industry, but also academicians, to have collaboration with those departments, not think of them, as like an external against silo, but this is someone that I need to collaborate with to make my contracts or my projects go ahead. So I need to know how to communicate to them. I need to know what their incentives are, and I need to have a bit of understanding how to solve these problems. But it always, on the brighter side, gets solved. I've never had a project that got canceled because there's an IP issue. If it was meant to be, if we had a good reasoning behind it, you just solve these problems. Again, I think it's a bit of speed and efficiency.
Thanks very much. So the IP issue is something that can be resolved given the right amount of time and, we're going to say, perseverance to see it through to conclusion. I have to say my own personal experience is one of delays, significant delays, and I always find, quite frankly, the academics who we want to talk to are very keen to find ways in which they can promote their science and see that translational process. I mean, they're all very, very aware of the importance of impact, but they have to operate within a system and processes, and sometimes it's a system and processes which thwarts the ability to progress that, rather than, if you like, the intent or the requirements of each party. So I think your comment about do it early I think is very, very important, because it does take time. And John, forgive me, I mean, have you, again, through the DRI, have you found ways to overcome some of those issues that that's, if you like, process rather than science per se or the commercial position, but just simply the process of getting across the barrier?
Well, any unit that is based in the university will obviously have to abide by university procedures. I think it's often really useful to have a conversation about what really has true IP value, especially in the context of the company that you're working with. And often they'll say that really the only IP they really care about is the chemical matter. And so one of the tricks we use here quite a lot is we keep the chemistry structures quite close. And in order to protect some of our academic collaborators, we don't share the structures with them. And this allows them to work with a greater number of companies, because they've never seen the structure. It avoids potential conflicts of interest for them. And so we can minimize some of these issues. And that way the negotiations are resolved more quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to just dial back to one of the questions that's come through, which is quite specific, but an interesting one. And it's from Askeli Ilmanen, I think it may be the right way to pronounce it. But so the question is this: following up on going beyond questionnaires, besides biomarkers, could language models and AI be used to characterize needs of patients? Are there databases that summarize patient needs in full in natural language and in reports? So in other words, can we actually, is the evidence already there to some extent in papers through the use of natural language processing? And indeed, are we collecting the data effectively from patient groups or indeed from clinical trials already that would allow us then to be able to analyze that data? Simon, I mean, have you been involved in any studies where your data has been collected in a way which could be subsequently used in an AI context?
I think the only study that I've recently, I had my data. I was involved in the GLAD study as a participant, but beyond that, no. And the reality, I am active within the psychiatric patient community. I don't know of stuff. I'm not approached. I don't know. I am not approached to share stuff through the networks of people that I have. So which tells me that if it is happening, it's happening in a piecemeal way. And I do think it could be done better. In terms of whether there's scope for AI to be used. Well, why not? We're in a space where we're thinking novel things. It might work, it might not, but unless we try, we won't know, will we?
Yeah.
This is the thing. It's how it fits together and how brave we're going to be. We keep coming back to bravery.
Yeah.
But if we do the same as we've always done, we'll get the same results as we've always had, and they haven't always been great. I can see Trudy waving.
Yeah, Trudy, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think there's a huge opportunity around this going forward, with AI and other areas. So that there is something called CRIS. I don't know if people have come across that, and that is a clinical record interactive search system which exists in one huge sort of academic centre in London, where actually for all mental health data records, you can extract, you can create a program and do NLP, the language processing, to extract different types of symptoms in different populations. And through that, we, in COVID, for example, we did the language processing to look at crisis presentations,
Okay.
who were feeling depressed or suicidal and were going to emergency departments, and to look at the numbers presenting, or people presenting with emotional instability or eating disorder problems. And actually the NLP allowed us to sort of look at the entire database of everyone presenting to a huge mental health trust, and see, compare the number there compared with actual diagnoses and numbers. So there are databases like that, and this particular one I think is probably the largest one across the UK that does that, the CRIS record system. So I think huge, potential going forwards, but also much more to do. And I think you also need to tie that up also with other biomarkers that individuals have. So if we can, use something like a CRIS database to look at a population health level, that's one element, but also pulling in an individual's other sort of biomarkers and neuropsychiatric markers.
And do you think that information is collected and curated in an effective way, or indeed, perhaps with NLP, it doesn't really matter as long as it's written down and it can be ingested as data? Do you need to have levels of consistency in diagnoses or records of comorbidities or other biomarkers?
No, I think you do need to have consistency. So just getting the data extracted isn't enough. I think you need to sort of tie that in with other questions that we have of a data set and of individuals or the population, but potentially a hugely positive way of thinking about new innovation. I mean, we can even we can use NLP to look at side effects of medication in an entire population, for example, in South London, and see actually does that give us a hint about a new treatment as a result of side effects of what people are currently getting.
Interesting. Yes. Yeah. Aslan, is that something? Are you contemplating the role of AI in identifying how you can best develop your own products?
Yeah, we actually have a team in Compass that does look at the digital side, the digital biomarkers that we mentioned, but also AI techniques, including NLP. And for us, it's especially important because our therapy approach is both pharmacology and psychological support.
Right, interesting.
So I think it's a bit of, we are a public company, so we need to justify why we are doing things and why we're investing into certain things. And similarly to digital biomarkers, there is early evidence for use of NLP, but it's still an early field. So we do research, and we're trying to get patient consent to be able to research on a larger group of patients, especially going through a psychedelic experience. But I think and it's going to happen very quickly, as we know, as the AI field develops, I think there will be more of this.
So the use of these technology, NLP or whatever, is one way to perhaps accelerate getting the evidence, which can support then the sort of the hypothesis of where you should put your resources. And I think it is fair to say these technologies are evolving. I mean, I confess I have a vested interest here. I'm actually chairman of an NLP company, which is using NLP to help to improve the early stage research of treatments across a whole wide range. And we are finding increasingly that people want to access the data that's out there. And it's in if you think about the academic literature that exists, whatever it is, 40 million documents, plus all the clinical diagnoses that exist, there's just far too much to be doing it all manually. There has to be a sort of technology approach which allows you to derive insights from looking at the data in a certain way. John, I presume that's also something which is actively engaged in your programs as well.
Yeah, I think there's barely a component of drug discovery that doesn't have AI in it somewhere now. We certainly use it for in our collaborations for compound design. It's used to analyze images. It's becoming commonplace almost.
Right, interesting. Okay, folks, so we're sort of drawing towards the end of the hour. I think we've had some really interesting conversations about how to best engage all parties in the process of developing treatments or addressing ways to treat the disease. I'm not sure we've yet come up with anything concrete that we'd like to take forward as the next step. So I'm going to ask all of you just to give me one thing that you'd like to do differently as a result of the conversations over the last seminar series. What would that be? And give us some food for thought here. So, Simon.
I think, for me, I think there is a role for organisations like the BNA for the Psychiatric Consortium in helping to lift us out of our bunkers and look more broadly for patient benefit. So that for me, it's about talking to each other, and maybe sort of broader organisations are the way to go with that.
Brilliant, thank you, Trudy.
Gosh, that's a difficult one. I think I'm going to plumb for something quite simple, actually, which is engagement with the public, which is about educating the public around how important it is to discover new drugs for mental health, mental illness, for psychiatry. Because I think that's a problem. I think people are not engaging sufficiently to help and destigmatizing these conditions, destigmatizing schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar disorder, serious depression, so that we can actually, I think that would be an enabler to the system changing.
Thank you, that's great. And actually, to be clear, the BNA has every 2 years what they call their Festival of Neuroscience, and they have within part of that is a very important component, which is engaging with the public. And so maybe there's some thinking about that. There's something we could do more direct in a more directed way for psychiatric diseases. But we should think on that one.
Just
yeah,
coming
please, Simon,
back really quickly, I think it's important who it is that's doing that education, because I think there's a degree of skepticism, and if pharma is seen to be educating on the needs for medicine, that will simply switch people off. And again, I come back to the need for more general organisations to engage in the types of activities that Trudy is suggesting.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's a good warning, and I think we should take heed of that. John, other than setting up a DRI for psychiatry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that is a step. In a way, that's a small step. I think what I would put my money behind is quite similar to what Simon and Trudy have said, but I'd word it slightly differently. I think what we need is a voice for the public. I think, that's where patient advocacy comes in. But we don't want 1,000 voices. They're lost in the winds. We need a loud voice. The voice needs to be coordinated, and that way you can put pressure on the government to increase funding for psychiatric research.
Right.
Without that, it will be very difficult to, get a groundswell running behind rejuvenating psychiatric research.
That's very good. Thanks very much, John. And actually, just from yourself, and we're sort of getting close to time, so we could.
I agree with everything that said. I think both BNA and Psychiatric Consortium are in a great place to enable both education and being the voice of public and patients.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, everybody. It's been a really interesting conversation. Sophie, I'm hoping, is listening. I'm going to finish here and let you just sort of wrap up the session and sort of complete the process.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to you all for joining today, all the attendees, but special thanks, of course, to Kevin and Simon and Ashley Han and Trudy and John. It's just been a fantastic discussion. And if you want to continue the conversation, we are joining in person for those of you who can join us in London on May the 11th. I've put the link in the chat. And as Kevin notes, we'll have lots of other events in the not too distant future, including the festival. So do stay in touch with us, and we will be publishing a report on this series very soon. So thank you, go well, have a good rest of the week. Thanks.
Thanks, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks for organising it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.